Welcome back to my channel, and we're gonna go with another episode of a truth teller, and this one is going to be DMX. So let's get right into it. Now, there are artists who rap, and then there are those who testify. DMX never just performed, he confessed. Every growl, every shout, every prayer was the sound of a man wrestling with his angels and his demons in public with no mask, no edit, and no apology. He didn't come to entertain, he came to warn. He came to wake up those who felt unseen, unheard, and unloved by the world's version of God. He was hip hop street preacher, the kind who didn't need a pulpit because the pavement was his church. DMX's truth didn't come from perfection, it came from pain. The system itself, which is the music industry, tried to label him an addict, criminal, problem child. But what they couldn't label was his spirit. He carried the trauma of a world that breaks black boys before it teaches them who they are. Yet in every interview, in every freestyle, you could hear him yearning for redemption. He said it himself. The same pain that made me a monster made me strong. That's the truth most people hide. DMX made it holy. DMX taught that the streets had their own gospel. When the church doors closed, the corner became a confessional. And through his rhymes, he turned every verse into a psalm, gritty, raw, and prophetic. He spoke for the ones who didn't fit in anyone's religion. He showed that God walks with those the world throws away. Every time he prayed on stage, he reminded us that you can be both sinner and saint and still be chosen. DMX's truth telling was dangerous because it wasn't polished, it was real. He exposed the music industry's spiritual warfare long before people had language for it. He knew that fame was a transaction, one that often demanded your soul. He resisted the image they tried to sell him and stayed loyal to the pain that made him authentic. He showed that being real isn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's about protecting your spirit in a world built to consume it. Every DMX prayer was a sermon in disguise. He prayed like a man who had seen the devil up close, not as theory, but as contract. He prayed like he was fighting for his life and ours. In his final years, he stopped running from his purpose and started walking toward it openly, publicly, and unapologetically. He was never the image of perfection, but he was the image of faith, not church faith, survival faith, the kind that still believes in God even when the world calls you crazy for it. DMX didn't leave behind a brand. He left behind a blueprint. He showed that your pain can be your pulpit. He proved that vulnerability is power. And he made it clear that truth, raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth, will outlive the lies that fame builds. He once said, if you're real, you'll never die. And that's prophecy, because his spirit still speaks through those who are tired of pretending tired of performing and ready to tell their own truth. DMX was more than a rapper. He was a spiritual disruptor. He barked truth in a world that loves silence. He showed that even the broken can be chosen, that even the lost can lead. If you've ever been misunderstood for the light you carry, remember this. DMX walked that road. No, you're not crazy for still having faith after everything tried to kill it. There was something different about DMX. He didn't perform for applause. He released truth like it was oxygen. He wasn't trying to sound perfect or look polished. He was bleeding out loud, and that made the world uncomfortable because realness has always been the enemy of control. See, DMX didn't come from the industry's idea of success. He came from survival. And when you come from survival, your words hit different. You don't speak to impress. You speak to free yourself and whoever's listening. He was one of the first to pull back the veil on the dark side of fame, long before people had the courage or the vocabulary. He told you that behind the lights there were shadows, behind the music there were rituals, and behind the dream there were chains. And he wasn't just talking about contracts, he was talking about spiritual contracts, about the price of authenticity in a system that feeds on illusion. The world tries to define him through his mistakes. They stamped him with words like troubled, addict, criminal. But those were just the labels of people too afraid to look deeper, because beneath that pain was a warrior spirit, the kind that refuses to die, even when it's been broken 1,000 times. DMX was the echo of every black boy who never got to be soft, who never got to be a child, who was taught to bark before he could pray. And yet, even in his rawest moments, he was praying out loud for all of them. He carried generations in his chest, the bruises, the burdens, the brilliance, and he turned it into testimony. He didn't fit neatly into any religion or doctrine, and that was the point. He stood in that sacred middle ground where streets meet scripture and the sacred meets the scarred. He spoke for the ones that church called too damaged and the system called too dangerous. He showed that holiness doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a hoodie, speaks in growls, and walks with a limp from everything it survived. On stage, when DMX closed his eyes and prayed, it wasn't performance, it was warfare. He wasn't talking about God, he was talking to God, right there in front of thousands who came to be entertained. He turned concerts into confessions and stages into sanctuaries. And in that space, you could feel something shift, like heaven stopped to listen. He refused to let the world repackage his pain into something marketable. He refused to clean up his truth to make it palatable because he knew that the rawness was sacred. The struggle was where God did his real work. While others tried to fit into images designed by executives, DMX stayed loyal to the soil he came from, to the trenches that taught him truth before theology ever did. That's what made him dangerous. Not his words, but his freedom. Because when a man learns how to speak truth without permission, he can't be controlled. DMX was proof that you don't have to be flawless to be favored. You don't have to be spotless to be called. He was living evidence that divinity can still dwell in the broken and that redemption doesn't always look clean. He didn't ask to be perfect, he asked to be real. And in a world addicted to pretending, that was the most radical prayer of all. DMX didn't come here to blend in. He came here to break patterns. While others polished their images to please executives, he stayed rooted in the soil that raised him, the real, the rugged, the raw. The streets were his first seminary. Pain was his first teacher, and survival was his first scripture. He didn't need a stage manager to teach him presence. His presence was the sermon. When he walked into a room, you felt something ancient move because he wasn't shaped by image. He was shaped by experience, the kind that can't be filtered, faked, or bought. DMX knew early that the industry had two faces, one that smiles and one that feeds. And while others smiled back, he stared straight into the darkness and spoke what he saw. Long before people had the courage or even the language to talk about it, he was already warning the world about what lurks behind the glitter. He saw how fame can feed off your faith, how the higher you rise, the more spiritual warfare you invite. And he chose truth, even when it cost him peace. That's what made him dangerous. Not his bark, not his rage, but his refusal to pretend. The world tried to brand him troubled, addict, criminal. They threw labels like stones, hoping one would stick. But they could never categorize his spirit because his story didn't fit in their reports. It fit in scripture. DMX carried the ache of every black boy who was told to be hard before he was allowed to be human. Every soul the system caged before it ever tried to understand. He became their voice, the roar that rose from silence. And through that roar, he reminded us that God still walks with those the world throws away. He was too real for religion and too anointed for the streets to claim. He stood in a crossroads between pain and purpose and made that tension holy. He showed that holiness doesn't always wear a suit or speak softly from behind a pulpit. Sometimes it wears a hoodie, it carries scars, and speaks in growls shaped by grief. Sometimes holiness limps because it's walked through hell and still came back praying. DMX never sanitized his struggle. He never dressed up his truth to make it easier to digest. He knew that the same pain that broke him was the same pain that made him real. And that realness, that refusal to disguise, became his ministry. He didn't care about being marketable. He cared about being honest. And that's why people felt him in their chests before they understood him in their mind. Because truth, when spoken without apology, cuts through everything fake. DMX lived what most people only preach. He walked through valleys most of us only quote scriptures about. And even when his demons were loud, his prayers were louder. He didn't run from God when he fell. He ran toward him every single time, over and over again. That's the sign of someone chosen. Not that they never fall, but that they never stop reaching for light in the middle of the storm. DMX wasn't an artist. He wasn't just an artist. He was a warning, a witness, and a warrior. Proof that you can be scarred and sacred at the same time. He left behind something the industry couldn't sell: truth, unpackaged, untamed, uncompromised. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it still. In every soul that refuses to trade authenticity for acceptance, in every person who chooses to stand raw and unpolished and say, I might be broken, but I'm still called. This was the divine force that gave him the roar, the same energy that lived in David when he faced Goliath, the same fire that burned in Elijah when he spoke truth to power. It was a prophetic spirit, not dressed in religion, but clothed in revelation. That's why he prayed like a soldier. That's why every time he bowed his head, he sounded like thunder. That spirit fought through him to reach others who had already given up God, to show them that holiness doesn't always come from clean places. Sometimes it comes from broken ones. He was chosen to speak from the dirt because that's where the lost souls live. And they wouldn't have listened to anyone who hadn't bled where they bled. There was also a gentler energy that walked with him, one that mourned for what he saw and carried. This spirit was ancestral, ancient, the voices of those who didn't survive the same systems that tried to destroy him. He was their vessel, their way of finally being heard. When he said, Lord, give me a sign, it wasn't just for himself. It was for millions who couldn't find the words. He prayed out loud because he was praying for an entire lineage that had been silenced. That's why his pain felt familiar, because it wasn't only his, it was all of ours. But make no mistake, DMX also wrestled with darker energies. Every truth teller does. Every prophet has to confront the shadows that guard the doors of purpose. He was targeted, tempted, tormented, because he was dangerous to deception. You could hear it in his music, that tug of war between light and shadow, salvation and self-destruction. Those weren't contradictions. Those were contenders. He wasn't possessed. He was pursued. Because light that bright doesn't go unchallenged. Underneath it all, the most powerful spirit that walked with DMX was the spirit of guidance. He may not have always known it, but he was being led step by step to show the world that God can dwell in chaos and still be God. That redemption isn't a straight path. It's jagged, it's painful, and sometimes it looks like failure before it looks like freedom. He carried a purpose that his body couldn't always handle, but his soul never let go. And when he left this world, that same spirit didn't die. It multiplied. It moved into the hearts of those who were moved by him. People who finally realized you don't have to be perfect to be prophetic. DMX was a vessel for truth that made both heaven and hell pay attention. It was a walking sermon about what happens when divine calling meets human pain. And even in his struggle, the spirits that walk with him, warrior, healer, ancestor, and guide, never left. They just kept fighting through him until the world finally listened. Stay covered, stay conscious, Stay undefeated. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.